set auto-destruct sequence.
It's the time allotted that concerns me.
Recognize Picard, Jean-Luc, Captain. Recognize Riker, William T., Commander.
Maximum warp.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the Warp Core Podcast. I am Urza Master. Joining me as always, Lord Uther and Fert Derby. Gentlemen, welcome, welcome. We have another boldly going episode today. And may I say, this is among the boldest episodes to go where no man should probably really go. We are talking Code of Honor with Star Trek The Next Generation, circa 1987. Fert Derby, tell us a little bit about this Tracy Torme episode.
Absolutely. Thank you. Warp Core fans, welcome to our just underway adventures of Star Trek The Next Generation. And this is the third episode of this fledgling series, Code of Honor. First aired on October 12th, 1987. I will remind you that at the time, Lord Uther and I were just 14 years old. And I think Urza Master was still just a warp core gleam at this point when this first trickled onto screens in syndication in Reagan's America. Our director for Code of Honor was Russ Mayberry. And actually our writers were Catherine Powers and Michael Barron. And we won't see too many more of their credits, I believe. Let's start with Russ Mayberry, director. He's a Northwestern grad. Worked mostly in television, did episodes of The Monkees, Bewitched, I Dream of Jeannie, The Brady Bunch, The Fall Guy, and Miami Vice, to but name a few. He also did an underappreciated Don Knotts Disney movie from 1979 called Unidentified Flying Oddball. And if you were a fan of Disney in the late 70s, things like The Rescuers and the Apple Dumpling Gang and so on, you'll remember Unidentified Flying Oddball. It was one of Russ's features. As far as our writers, Catherine Powers and Barron, Powers wrote for Charlie's Angels, Fantasy Island, Airwolf, and Stargate SG-1, which I know also has a fevered following on the internet. And Michael Barron was a Cal State Northridge grad. He ended up, after this gig, becoming a store manager for T-Mobile, starting in 2002. So, you know, tasted the Hollywood dream briefly, but then got down to trying to sell you that 5G plan. All the way back in 2002. So again, you rise, you fall. Sometimes you sell phones. And I'd also like to point out the leader, Lutan, of the alien world that the Enterprise is visiting this week is played by Jesse Lawrence Ferguson. John Carpenter fans will remember him from Prince of Darkness as one of the unfortunate grad students, Calder. He ends up singing Amazing Grace before offing himself with a piece of Stairwell. He also does an uncredited cameo in that film as the Devil, emerging as a shadowy figure from the front of a church, and his sequences are interspersed throughout the picture. He was also apparently a bad cop in Boys in the Hood, 1991, John Singleton's debut. So, lots in front of and behind the camera, and also a little bit of drama. We talked about how the first couple of seasons of Next Generation were trying to find their footing. I'll make a little bit more of a comment on that near the end of our broadcast. But actually, Russ Mayberry was fired while this episode was being shot during production, and he was replaced by who would become a longtime Star Trek sort of behind-the-scenes assistant director, Les Landau. Why was Russ fired? It's reported but never really confirmed. The allegations was that he was a little bit racist towards some members of the cast, not the principal cast, but the guest cast on this planet. And that requires just a little bit of context here. The original episode written by Powers and Barron suggested a sort of samurai-like world, a model, and based on the ancient code of Bushido, and that you had a planet who would follow these doctrines and guidelines very strictly. And somehow during the pre-production and the production process, Russ Mayberry had a hand in altering that vision and turned it more into a 1940s sort of African tribal motif.
As Tracy Torme pointed out.
Yes. Tracy Torme, whom we can't wait to discuss his contributions to the show this season and I think next season before he goes off to create his own science fiction cult classic. So stay tuned, Warp Core. Tracy Torme is a big part of this early Trek. But in any event, whether or not he was, this or that, he said, she said, they said, some of those undertones are what we're going to be discussing here on Code of Honor. Because, gentlemen, this is an episode that many of the cast have taken great pains over the years to distance themselves from. They were sort of uncomfortable or embarrassed by it, if you believe online reports. Patrick Stewart has mentioned it in passing as an early episode that he was not proud of, et cetera, et cetera. And it seems to be primarily for the portrayal of the tribal planet. Basically these African American men and women who are sort of portrayed sort of one-dimensionally according to standards. Now, here's where I start the discussion for me. The episode itself, Tasha Yar is being coveted and is forced to fight for her honor and for the hand of marriage for the charismatic Lutan. That's what's going on plot-wise here. But is the episode, as several have suggested online, is it racist, as they say? Is it demeaning? Is it racially insensitive? And I think all of those questions, which is something that Star Trek has always tried to handle head on, I think it's all in the eye of the beholder. It's all in the eye of context. I think without making any kind of sort of blanket statement about, race and ethnicity and gender and all of these things, I think this show probably looked very different from October 12th, 1987 than it does in 2025. I don't think, which is not to say an excuse, but there was a certain blind spots when it came to other ethnicities and portrayals in Hollywood. That's just a fact. Throughout, as Hollywood slowly learned to evolve and so forth. I would call to anyone's attention Ron Howard's Gung Ho from 1986, dealing with Japanese auto workers taking over a Midwestern auto plant. I would call attention to John Hughes's portrayal of the exchange student Long Duck Dong in 16 Candles. I would go back 20 years before the 80s to Mickey Rooney's portrayal as an Asian landlord, Mickey Rooney, in Breakfast at Tiffany's. So even if Star Trek had somehow crossed the proverbial Rubicon or red line in terms of or portrayal, I don't really, from this viewer's perspective, think that that was intentional. And I don't think that they were, quote, being racist. I just think that things can kind of fall in terms of people's tolerance and acceptance of what it was that they were showing. So I'm stating for the record, and keeping in mind my own values and all of that, I don't necessarily find this episode racist. I think at best, looking at it from a contemporary perspective, it's probably a little insensitive just in terms of what we're seeing. The episode itself, it actually, the planet, their inhabitants, it's actually a fairly progressive society. Like in their society, the women own all the property and seem to have all the wealth, so forth. And so Lutan is scheming to acquire his partner's wealth and power and influence by having Tasha Yar eliminate her. And then he can have, the brass ring, if you will. And the Enterprise ends up foiling this scheme. And the tables are turned by the episode's end, and he ends up demoted in the patriarchal, hierarchical cycle. And his wife ends up not only being spared in the duel to the death, but ends up getting the upper hand and being with somebody who probably loves her a little more anyway. So, like I say, I think Star Trek inherently has auto brakes in it to keep it from venturing into some dark and distasteful places. But I think overall, you kind of wince a little just because, again, we are not in 1987 anymore, and there were ways to modify or mitigate some of that backlash that they just didn't. They just wasn't on people's screens. Again, to be fair, audiences and creators alike just have, over the years, naturally become more comfortable and better at expressing, cultural differences and so forth. If this episode were to be redone by the Strange New Worlds, for example, franchise, you'd see a much different, I think, result overall in terms of all of that. And that's just, how we grow, how we evolve. And
don't you think that's always easy to say looking back? Again, I'm not saying it's right.
Right.
But I think it's looking backwards at things. It's to be able to say that, right?
Right.
I mean, it's like anything in history.
Let me ask the crew, especially
Looking back.
someone who teaches history professionally. Did any of that bother you? Whether you saw what was printed online about this or not, was it something that struck you as a viewer either then or now?
Well, of course. Anytime you're putting someone in a racial situation like that, it bothers me.
Right.
Right. But again, hindsight is 20/20, and I'm not saying it's right. It's just like looking at any point in history. That's the way people were acting, and I'm not saying it's right. With that being said, I actually think this episode was talking about females being strong. That's what isn't that why he wanted Tasha Yar too?
Right.
She's a strong female, right? I think that was there, and the other thing is, I think this was their Pon farr episode of having people fight over a mate in a sense. Like that's the way it was coming across to me. Because I think that's one thing we see shades of a lot in the first season, or at least maybe the first couple episodes, is trying to give original series, again, this is looking backwards, giving original series fans a taste of that in Next Gen. So to me, that's what I was kind of seeing here. And yes, I was also seeing the racial elements as well, which are not right. Urza?
I've watched this episode several times, and I agree it's not good. It's not a good episode. To be honest, I think it's because it's Tasha Yar forward more so than it is a 1940s tribal Africa kind of poorly concepted structure, and it really is just the Kirk and Spock fight playing out in a different venue. One thing I would point out, and I think it is apropos, at the time, it was probably not as, you do have roots going on. So I think there was some attunement to race at the time that even by today's standards, it was probably a little bit ill-conceived. I think that the concept is good. I think if you put a different or a more diverse cast of aliens together rather than just all black aliens, you probably get a better result. I think it was just poorly conceived that, oh, let's make them all like African tribal who live by Bushido and have this, odd scheming murder plot. It's not a bad concept. It's just the way you put it together on this particular screen did not fly very well. I think, yeah, Strange New Worlds, if they tackled an episode like this, if you made them all lizard people, or if you made it like, even just a multiracial cast of aliens, you'd change the whole dynamic in a better way. I think it's kind of embarrassing, especially given the progress of the era that it came out in, to not rely on such stereotypes or such stereotypical portrayals to tell a good, compelling story. And I think this could be an interesting story. I still don't think it's great. No matter what you do with it to make it better, I think it's just bad. I don't know that it's outright racist, but I do think that it's a little tone deaf, even for 1987. Certainly looking back now, it's like, oof. You wouldn't make this episode today. And I think most of the cast, has said it varies. I know Michael Dorn, I think, specifically said he was so glad he wasn't in that episode. And what strikes me as funny is, like, it's Code of Honor and you have a Klingon on the ship. How is this not a Klingon episode? First of all, they have not really addressed having a Klingon on a Federation ship at this point. What more perfect time would there be than an episode called Code of Honor? Like, I think it would have been more interesting if Worf had been on the episode, if he would have been the object of the female property owners' like affections, and that created tension between the two male leads. And then, they had to, Worf with his Starfleet honor, more so than his honor as a warrior or something. And the struggle between establishing that identity, that makes a good episode. That sounds good. But Tasha Yar, being, it's just so contradictory. She's so good at Aikido, and she's so strong, and she's their chief of security, but she's like very easily kidnapped. And really can't fight off a couple of dudes. Like, seriously? It just undersells her character, and she is a character of contradictions. Like, I hate to say it, but they really tried to push her so hard in this first season. I think there's a reason she doesn't continue beyond this first season. Not to spoil anything, but it really just, it was not a well executed episode, and I think that shines through more so than any kind of racial overtones. I think.
I think it's a great point that they're definitely trying to push her, and that's the question I was going to ask you guys: is season one, if you take her out and you put Worf into that position in season one, is season one better? Because, spoiler alert, moving forward, you can continuously see them trying to figure out what to do with Worf, what to do with LaForge, even with Wesley a little bit. And is season two, which, again, we're jumping ahead a little bit, is season two better without Pulaski? And my personal answer to both of those questions is yes. Season one and is that season two where Pulaski comes in, or is that season three?
Season two.
Season two. I think those seasons are better, even though it gets better. I think those seasons are better without the two of them involved. I will say this, going back and watching these again, Urza kind of brought this up in our chat. How do you stop? Like, I wanted to keep watching the next episode. It's definitely pulled me back in, and I'm trying to figure out if it's because I miss it, or if it's because I know what's going to happen in like those magical seasons of things start to change a little bit more in 3, and then we have 4, 5, 6, and 7, and it's everything you want in Star Trek. So that's what I'm trying to rationalize in my mind right now, looking backwards. Because even when I was watching this originally, I don't know how into it I truly was until those following seasons. I mean, it had my interest, but I wasn't planning to watch it every week like I was when seasons 4, 5, 6, 7 came out, where I would literally plan on watching it even with friends. So
I think this is something that we can clearly see, even though we're only a few episodes in to this maiden voyage. Star Trek had to learn how to evolve from its past. And the first season and a little bit of the second season, there was a heavy Gene Roddenberry hand behind the scenes. He was much more involved at the outset. And Star Trek had to learn how to move past the Roddenberry years, all the way dating back to the original series, and become something new, which it does later, spoiler alert, under the stewardship of Rick Berman and Michael Piller and so forth. But before they could learn to tell those Star Trek stories and engage with the characters, they had to take these steps. And so what we're seeing is they desperately want the connection for fans, and they desperately want to have new audiences and new eyeballs. And those two are not always running in synchronicity, because you've got to please one master, but then are you doing that at the expense of young 14-year-olds who are tuning in each week? I can say that if this was these first couple of episodes, I mean, I did see the pilot when it came out, and then I just kind of drifted away for a few seasons. Just, I had other interests, and David Lynch appeared out of nowhere and mesmerized me with Twin Peaks and so on. I can say that rewatching them like our fellow bridge mates are doing now, it's compulsive. There is an addictive quality because we know where this journey is going to lead us and all the highlights along the way, and we want to get to those moments, but before we can, we have to have this fumbling of, well, what's Geordi really doing? I'll tell you one thing this episode does right really quick. And it's something that, like Strange New Worlds and other shows, The Mandalorian and things that we're watching today, they did right. And I don't know if they did it on purpose or it was just a happy accident. But we're still talking about, I mean, it's not a serialized show at this point. It's not a show that depends each week on, like, I have to know the conspiracy of the smoking man from the X-Files or so on. But emotionally, character-wise, we're trying to build off of concepts we saw in the encounter at Farpoint. We're still talking about Wesley being allowed on the bridge in this episode. We're still talking about Riker's reluctance to let Picard go on an away mission when it should be his first officer. Like, those are things that were raised in the pilot, and now here we are in the 2 episodes, after that, and we're still sort of litigating that and evolving it and making choices. And that's cool. So we're getting this emotional characterization serial storytelling where you're like, I remember that. Riker was like, he and Picard had this whole thing about, I would never let my captain put himself in harm's way. And now here it's being played out. And it's not being played out as some, flimsy argument, but the bridge crew is debating the merits. Do we send him? Does he not go? Will it insult the population? What's the best play here? So they're working it out in real time, and that's cool, right? That's actually another highlight of an episode that, again, is basically a muck time. With, I don't know, when I watch that, if you've ever seen on ESPN, they have like the Ultimate Tag Championships, and they have these guys like flinging themselves through bars and so forth, like trying to tag each other before the clock runs out. That's what I was seeing. I was seeing this jungle gym, one thing that they insert here. Here, we'll put obstacles. and then you can swing, weapons at each other. So that was my take.
It was American Gladiators in
There you
space,
go. There you go.
pretty much. So, and that begs the question. I mean, with an episode as maligned as this one, maybe rightfully is, where does this fall on your Warp Core rating scale? Because this is something that I struggle with these early episodes. So, Fert Derby, where are you putting this on your Warp Core?
I am allowing, and the Warp Core numbers versus the show. I am going to allow a little bit of tolerance here because I have to tell you, I am really enjoying this crew, this show. Even if the actual efforts don't always rise to the top. I had a number in mind. I think in our discussion and our transparency in terms of what it's, the feels that it's giving us, I think that this is 3.25. It's not a travesty. There are good things in the episode, that good little tiny seeds that we can, advance along. I'm not a fan of Tasha Yar. I'm not a fan of Denise Crosby's sort of performance level, but I mean, she's there, and we'll deal with her as we move along. I see what they're doing with Will Wheaton. I know he too drew a lot of fire pre-internet days, as why do we have the boy constantly around? But I get what they're trying to do, so I sort of appreciate, I appreciate him in theory, maybe not necessarily in fact, but I appreciate what Wesley Crusher is supposed to be. So I'm going to go 3.25 here, gentlemen. It certainly is not going to hit the high notes. I don't think it belongs in the basement. I just think we have to be prepared that it's going to take some baby steps to grow and become the show that we all know it can be.
I was going to go, it's funny that you said, because I'm going to go 3.5. As the youngins would say, it's a mid episode. Trying to move everything forward. I like your idea that they're still trying to reinforce some of those first plot points. One more thing I want to say that I think is an excellent point by Fert is the idea of Roddenberry handing it off, right, to Rick Berman, and I think we're seeing that now with Star Wars. We're clinging to the old George Lucas-y stuff for such a long time, and now that it's going to be in Filoni's hands, it seems like it's going to be in his hands on a go forward here with Kathleen Kennedy leaving and things like that. You get it into the right person's hands, and you're going to see some great things, and that's what we wind up seeing with Star Trek, right? And that's our hope that we're going to see with Star Wars as that moves forward. But that's an entirely different podcast, which you can always find in our archives and pending rebrand.
Ooh, catchphrase. Yeah, I'm going to go with 3. Not just because my 3-year-old decided to come and interrupt the recording, but this wasn't an abysmal episode, but it was bordering on it. It was okay. I think going back and watching it now, it's actually a little better than it was when I saw it. Like, I think the first time I saw this was in the early 90s when it hit syndication. And I think Jonathan Frakes didn't want them to re-air this episode, and I see why. It's just not good. I mean, there's the race bit about it, but it's really overall not a strong episode. I will say that there are a lot of fervent Tasha Yar fans out there. I don't know why. I really don't, and it's nothing against Denise Crosby. I do think they had an opportunity to do something with her that would have been so much more entertaining, and they kind of left it off as a one-off. But this episode really just judged on its merits is just a rebrand of Amok Time, and not well done. I also think it's funny that the holodeck is shown for the first time, and it has a corded phone interface. Which, hey, I agree with Fert Derby. This is baby steps towards the eventual product we get out of Next Generation. And it did make me want to watch more. Maybe because I was like, this episode again. Maybe because I was like, you know what? You are building out this cast and crew, and they are feeling each other out. And if you look at it from a new crew that came together at Farpoint to what we eventually get, seasons 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, I think it has a little bit more panache in that sense, but it is still a little baffling. So with that, fans, we leave you until we boldly go back to the Next Generation cast and see what they do next time. Stay with us, subscribe, like, share, comment. What did you think about this interesting, maybe maligned episode correctly? And let us know what you want to see next out of the Next Generation crew. Until such a time, make it so.